I believe that we are connected and ready to go. I will start with attendance if that's all right, Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
Okay, sorry for the delay, everyone. I will take a roll call for TMCRMC for November 4th. City of Avondale, Gina Montez. I have her marked as present. City of Buckeye, Roger.
Sorry about that.
Okay, that's okay. City of Buckeye, Roger Klinger.
I'm here.
City of Chandler, Josh Wright.
Yes.
City of El Mirage, Autumn Grooms.
I'm here.
Town of Fountain Hills, Dave Trimble.
Here.
Town of Gilbert, Mary Goodman. City of Glendale, Kevin Link.
Here.
City of Goodyear, Julie Arundel.
Present.
Maricopa County, Reed Kempton.
I'm here.
City of Mesa, Chris Brady.
Here.
City of Peoria, Eric Strunk.
Here.
City of Phoenix, Ed Zerker or Jesus Sapien.
Jesus, I'm here, Pat.
Okay. Town of Queen Creek, Bruce Gardner.
Here.
City of Scottsdale, Mark Melanchenko.
Here.
City of Surprise, Mike Gent.
Good morning.
City of Tempe, Stephen Methvin.
I'm here, Pat.
Okay. And Aubrey Perry from ADOT.
I'm here.
Okay, great. We're ready to go, Chair.
Hey, Pat.
Right.
I'm sorry. Yes.
I apologize. Mary Goodman from Gilbert. I believe I missed my name on the roll call.
Oh, great. I have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pat. Welcome, everyone, and welcome those viewing on YouTube or other means. Just real quick logistics. Certainly, if anyone has a question, we've got this nice chat room. You can funnel those through, or of course, online. We also ask that if you can, all attendees, participants mute the computer microphone when you're not speaking or making a point. It'll help us with the bandwidth as usual. So with that, we'll kind of move on. Got a busy agenda today, Pat. I think the first item of order is the public comment. Anything you'd like to report there?
I will be contacting Blue Crowley later this afternoon to provide his comments, and they will be inserted into the meeting minutes that you all will approve in January.
Great, thank you. Very good. We'll move on to item number 2, which is the CEO's report. And I'd like to invite Mr. Smith to make any comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple quick items because we've got a lot to get through. Wanted to give you an update on some things that have happened since the last time we met. The first thing, Pat, if you want to advance the slide. Beyond that. The first thing is that we held a very successful clean air campaigns. As you can see on the slide, that's our 33rd annual. And our staff came together under the direction of Lillian Duarte and really did a great job in moving this from its normal banquet style of presentation to a virtual presentation with a few members there in the boardroom. And we'd just like to thank all of those who participate. We have several hundred people participate virtually in this program. And this is very important because it recognizes what those in the community are doing, and especially your staff. There's a lot of cities that were award recipients, and a lot of cities that participated in activities that help to clean up our air. So thanks to all for joining in this virtual award, which ended up being very, very successful, even though we weren't able to join together in a big hotel ballroom. The next thing I want to talk about is we've received the first delivery of our new commuter bus. As you can see, this is a very much a departure from how we provided express services currently. Through normally our either 40-foot or 60-foot buses. And if you'll recall, when you approved moving forward this to the board and the board approved it, while these buses may look like we're stepping up a new level of service, they are actually less expensive to both purchase and operate than our 60-foot articulated buses, while having about the same capacity. So we're excited to work toward putting these into service. As you can see on the interior, it's a very, very nice interior, which gives a more tour bus kind of experience to our passengers. The door there in the middle of the bus, there's really sort of, I guess you'd call it a vestibule, and that has a couple, 3 spaces for wheelchair and ADA riders. So we are able to accommodate all types of riders on this, and we're looking forward to implementing this in valley-wide in our express service. So just wanted to let you know about that. And that's and the next thing is our upcoming meetings. We will, of course, Pat, next slide, please. We will, of course, continue to do these virtually until further direction and notice. One thing I want to make you aware of is that on November 19th, we are going to be having a detailed study session discussion with our board on Prop 400 extension issues. It will be very similar to the presentation you're going to receive today on that. And so I just wanted to give you a heads up and let you know that the discussion will be moving to the policymakers on that at that time. And then on December 17th, our board has asked us to meet and talk about to separate our operators. That is moving forward on the entire fleet, which is a very large fleet, about 900 buses combined. And we'll be starting, I believe, this month or in December in the actual installation. That'll take a few months to install. So we're looking for that work to commence within a few short weeks here and going through the first quarter of 2021.
Great, thank you. Any questions on the COVID update? All right, I don't hear any, so we'll move on to the very next item, which is obviously on a lot of our minds, and there's another conversation taking place at the MAG level, and basically we all know around the table that the transit tax Prop 400 is set to sunset in 2025. So there's a big effort to assemble all the member cities of MAG and those in Valley Metro to look at what the horizon has in place with respect to possibly continuing that tax. And as a part of that, earlier this year, we all know there's a portal opened by MAG to allow us to submit transit, transportation related items. And from that, it looks like there's a good number that made their way to Valley Metro. Scott's group is responsible for the transit related functions of that. And Scott and his team, along with MAG, are going to kind of walk through a presentation they've developed that kind of talks about the metrics that you're proposing to employ to help assess value and at some point recommend with approval, our input, and so on in the coming months. So it's a discussion, it's a presentation. And at this point, all comments will be noted for the record, which is a good thing. But we'll, with further ado, we'll have Scott and his team kind of take this conversation and walk us through what they're proposing to present. So Scott, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric, and we appreciate this opportunity. And just to expand a little bit on how Eric introduced it, as you all recall, the portal was opened a few months ago, and there were literally hundreds of projects submitted for consideration in the upcoming Prop 400 plan, extension plan, and the regional transportation plan. Just a reminder, 1/3 of the Prop 400 taxes go to transit. A good chunk of those are split between operations and some capital. So it is a very significant part of the existing Prop 400 collections. A little bit of history, some of you were around, some of you weren't. Prior to Prop 400, transit was not funded on the regional level. This was a very, very big departure from the way things were done in the past, when it was decided as part of the plan that was submitted to voters and approved by the legislature, submitted to voters, that this 1/3 would be taken out of the half-cent sales tax. So about a little less than 0.2% of the tax goes to transit. That means that the regional funding of transit and the resource has expanded considerably in the last 20 years, which is a big difference in this conversation as opposed to the conversation when Prop 400 was first approved in 2004. With many of the projects being submitted, actually over 300 of the projects being submitted through the portal, MAG requested that Valley Metro staff prepare an analysis of these projects, and that's what you're going to see today. And as we go through this analysis, we're not looking at project by project. It's an overview to set the stage for hopefully data that helps the policymakers who will make these final decisions, help them to shape what those priorities may be. And we'd like to start with the two basic questions that are going to be are really the center of this discussion, and that you see. First is, what is a regional transit system? How do we define regional transit? The reality is we don't have a purely regional transit system. We have I call it a quilt or a hodgepodge of local transportation that are sewn together to create a regional system. And that creates difficulties as we discuss as to what really is regional transit. The reason this is important is because the Prop 400 tax is a regional tax. Therefore, it's regional resources. So the two things I'd really like you to think about as we're going through this presentation and as we go forward in the future are these two questions. How are we going to define the regional system, and how are we going to allocate regional resources that go into that? There's a very sobering reality, and as you'll see through both our staff and MAG staff presentations, is that, as in most things, our appetite and our expectations for what we can do on a regional basis far outstrip the resources that are available. As a matter of fact, for those of you who were around in 2009 when we rebalanced the program, the Great Recession really sucked about 40%, a couple $2 billion out of our projected transit collections. Therefore, the system we have on a regional, that we fund on a regional basis, doesn't even match what was promised and what was started to be delivered through Prop 400 in 2004. So keep these in mind as you go through this presentation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Omar Peters from our staff and Marty Zeke, who will go through our analysis and explain a little bit more about what our staff did with the information through the portal and with what MAG asked us to do as our part. And I'll turn it over to Omar and Marty. Omar, you want to take it from
Thank
here?
you, Scott. Yes, thank you, Scott, and good morning, everyone. So Scott went over this a bit, and I'll just give a quick overview again of what we'll be sharing today and the tasks that we have been doing. So really we'll be taking a look at today's numbers 1 and 2. Our team has worked through and mapped and analyzed each of the projects that were submitted through the portal. We also identify the gaps and the potential opportunities as we lay those out and started stitched together regionally. We started to take a look at where those gaps are. So Marty Zeke is going to share several maps, and we'll be able to take a look at how this all fits together. The third one here, we are working on assessing and estimating the overall cost of these submitted projects, and also taking a look at how to fit them all together regionally. So we'll be also identifying the cost of the gaps. We are still on the way of developing these costs, so we'll not be sharing any specific costs today. We have a very high level sketch number, and that's what we'll talk about later in the presentation. So I'm going to start off with one map, just to kind of set the stage of where we are currently, what transit services we fund currently. So this map shows the purple are all of the routes and services that are funded regionally. The green are routes and services that are funded locally, and the blue are a mix of those routes, a mix of those funding sources. We see that by the end of the existing proposition, Prop 400, that to fund the purple and the blue, so the regional funded projects, we'll be looking at $104 million annually in 2020 dollars. And take in mind that that does not include capital improvements to continue operating those services such as fleet needs. It also does not include the rail operations and a state of good repair associated with that. And also, again, with this map, does not include the green. So it does not include what we're funded right now locally. So the $104 million is really for the purple lines and the blue lines. And you can see there are not a whole lot of those. So Scott mentioned that we received 300 projects. So that specific number is 304 projects from the call for projects through the portal. That, of course, is just a portion of the regional transportation projects that are submitted. Transit was just 24% of that. It also includes 24 programmatic submissions, set-asides, that includes, for example, a program for implementing and operating the commuter rail service, or a program for improving transit stop improvements. Our team went through these 304 projects, and we generally broke them out into 5 categories, and that's how we'll be looking at them today. So those 5 categories, so just starting off on the left, the green is really just improving the existing services. So we're really improving the performance. So it includes frequency improvements, span of service improvements of what we have right now. New transit service, that's a new service, so a new route, a new park and ride, and such. State of good repair, pretty self-explanatory, just trying to keep what we have right now in good operating and safe operating conditions. New technologies and services, that blue, very small category, but we did want to call it out to show what innovative type of projects and ideas have come through the submissions. And the final one, the red, is expanding the high-capacity transit system. So new BRT lines, new light rail lines, new streetcar lines, and the commuter rail. Today, we'll particularly be spending time on the green, the purple, and the red. So again, the maps that Marty Zeke will share will be focused on those projects. One final map I want to show before we turn it over to Marty is just setting the stage that we know that there are locally funded projects. So this map shows an example of T2050 from the City of Phoenix that our improvements are being funded locally. We wanted to include these in the map, even though that the projects that were submitted for the regional program, we wanted to include the locally funded improvements also, just to really see how they all fit together regionally. How does that regional picture look like? And now I'll turn it over to Marty as he runs through each of the projects that were submitted, looking at them regionally, how they all fit together, and particularly seeing where those gaps are.
Thank you, Omar, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be showing you a series of 7 maps that identify the vast majority of those 304 projects that were submitted by the cities. And they are broken down into categories, as Omar had alluded to, the green, the red, and the purple. So starting out with the green category, improving transit performance, what you're seeing here is all of the identified projects for bus frequency improvements. So I'm going to talk you through the maps to start out as we go through each one individually, and then kind of point out the specific pieces of it. So on here, what you're seeing, the gray lines in the background, that's our existing system. And the dotted lines are proposed extensions, which we'll show in a future map. The dark gray lines and kind of those wider lines, that's our existing high frequency network as defined by this transit standards and performance measures. Now, when we look at the different colors of lines, these are all of the identified projects that were brought up. So in the Northwest Valley, you see a lot of bus frequency improvements, especially in Glendale, and that's mainly to match the frequency of Phoenix. So instead of buses turning around at the Phoenix border, they now continue to the end of line. And then in the Southeast Valley, you see quite a bit going on there. There are, similar to in the Northwest Valley, frequency improvements identified to just bring those service levels up. And then you have those thick yellow lines. And those essentially are meant to match the thick gray lines that you see there to serve as the region's high frequency network, as defined by the TLCP. And then finally, those blue lines are an identification that Tempe would also like to improve the frequency of its orbit system. Now, looking at the gaps, so you're going to see these types of ovals on the vast majority of the maps that I'm going to be talking through with you today. Essentially, what we wanted to do here is show that, yes, we do have projects that are submitted, but we wanted to acknowledge that these were submissions by individual cities. And as we look to what Scott had said at the initial start of this presentation, creating really that regional system, we need to think about what our regional priorities are and how we can make the best use of our limited funding to provide something that can give a seamless transit experience regardless of where in the valley you are. So one route I'd like to point out as an example of this is Route 81, which is Hayden-McClintock, kind of at the east side of Scottsdale, Tempe, and Chandler. And what we see there is that Tempe had identified that they'd like to see an improvement in the frequency, but they were the only city that looked for that. So as the way that that would currently run, if this were to move forward as a program as is that you would have buses that would essentially be turning around at both ends of the Tempe border, and then every other bus essentially continuing either south or further north. Now continuing, looking at another transit performance improvement, these are the span of service. Now this is quite straightforward. Essentially in the Northwest Valley, you have cities that are looking to match the span of service for Phoenix. So essentially extending how long buses run into the night. So if you see as an example that you're on Route 80 and in Phoenix it runs until later on than it does further west, these cities are essentially wanting to make sure that the route will continue to run later on as well in there. And then in the Southeast Valley, what we see is routes that have been identified to essentially match the span of service of the light rail. So if you take the train into those East Valley areas and you get off, there is a bus waiting for you to take you to your final destination. We did identify gaps here as well. And these are essentially where, similar to the last slide, you would have buses that would be stopping to run at a certain time of night in certain cities. And then on those that have identified where they would like to improve the span of service, you would have portions of those routes where the buses would run later. And the one to look at on this is Route 136, which is the Gilbert Road bus. It has been identified by 2 cities in the northern portion and the southern portion of the route as a candidate to have that increased span, but then there's no identification in the center. So that would need to be a regional decision if we were to use regional funding to operate that type of service. Does that route justify having a regional contribution to extend the span of service for the entire route? Moving on. Bus route extensions. This one's pretty straightforward. So as in the past slides, those gray lines are our existing network. And then the orange lines that you can see, those orange solid lines, those are the routes that we've identified as ones that have extensions proposed for them. So the way to look at that is if you are trying to catch a bus anywhere along any one of those orange lines, you would benefit from being able to take that bus further out in the valley. And then the hatched lines kind of at the edges, especially in the northwest and the southeast, those are the specific extensions that have been identified. The gaps that we looked into, not a ton here, but mainly in the West Valley. And the one I'd like to point out is the Route 170, where Peoria and Surprise have both identified that they would like to extend the Bell Road bus further west. But that portion that we show as a gap, that's Sun City. And to ensure that we would have that regional process to extend that bus further west, we would need the county to give their buy-in so we would have the ability to run that route a few miles through the county in Sun City to then be able to reach destinations further west. In terms of new bus routes, so what you're seeing here is similar to past slides, but we just colored it a little bit differently to make sense as we continue on. So the light green, that's our existing local bus network. The gray is our rail network, as well as the extensions that have been proposed, and of some of which are under construction. And then the purple lines are the existing circulators in the valley. Blue are what Phoenix are looking to add in terms of new bus routes using T2050. And then all of these are the new circulators that have been proposed. So quite a bit in the Northwest Valley, as well as in the Southwest Valley and the East Valley. And the way to look at this, the lines are specific routes that have been identified by cities as to where they'd like circulators. And then the kind of blobs, those are the areas in which cities would like to see circulators come in, but they have not yet identified specific routing. In terms of microtransit systems, a few cities have identified that as a potential option to serve different areas. And then finally, there are new local routes that have been proposed. And we did identify gaps on this map as well. And as an example of a regional decision that would need to be made if we were to try to implement this sort of a system, L161 in Fountain Hills is where Fountain Hills has identified a potential need for a local route out to that city. But for that route to connect into the rest of the region's system to essentially the endpoint of the current Route 80, the Northern Shea bus, it's about a 7-mile gap where the region would need to decide if resources should be allocated to run that type of a service. And then kind of building off what we were looking at before in terms of new routes, these are new park and rides and express routes that have been proposed. So the way to look at this, the pink lines are our existing express rapid network, and then the pink dots are our existing park and rides throughout the valley. The blue lines on there, as we've alluded to in the past, that is what Phoenix would like to fund locally with T2050 money. So that is extending a couple extending a couple rapid routes further north, as well as adding a new rapid on the new Ed Pasteur portion of the Loop 202, as well as a new park and ride in Levine. And then the Prop 400 extension funded routes that have been identified are in that darker kind of maroon color, and the new park and rides that cities have identified as potential new facilities they would like to be funded through this tax extension are the purple dots. And we did identify gaps here as well. You can see 4 on there. That's essentially just acknowledging that these facilities have been proposed, but we would need to also run routes to get to those facilities. And then looking at high capacity transit. So essentially everything I've shown you over the past 5 maps is shown on this screen right here. This is the existing network as well as all of those new potential additions that we were looking into. Now adding in everything that Omar had brought up near the beginning on T2050. And then we get into what potentially could be funded through this tax extension. A few BRT projects were identified in different parts of the valley. In Mesa, there were a couple areas that were identified as potentially having a need for high capacity transit in the future. However, the mode has not yet been identified, so that's why it's listed as undefined. In terms of streetcar, as the existing streetcar is about to get started in about a year, we do see a few different cities, Tempe, Mesa, and Chandler to be specific, looking at expanding the streetcar system in the Southeast Valley. And then in terms of the light rail network, a lot of this should look familiar. So you have the I-10 West extension, L71, the Camelback West extension on L66 to serve Grand Canyon University, and then that large blob in the middle with A33 representing the Northeast extension, which could potentially take light rail out to Paradise Valley Mall, A32 going out to ASU West, and then L175, which is a submission from the city of Glendale for if Phoenix were to extend light rail out to ASU West, Glendale would like to extend that a mile further west along Thunderbird into Glendale. And then finally, these are the submissions that we've gotten from the cities in terms of establishing a sort of a commuter rail network. And what we did for this is added onto it essentially the plans from MAG in terms of where a potential commuter rail network could go, just to kind of show what it would take to fill that in and build the entire commuter rail network for the region. And then finally, the last map that I'm showing before I'll hand it back to Omar is just to identify that this will have an impact on the paratransit in the region. And I just want to talk through quick what that would look like. So the hatched lighter purple color you see mainly in the Central Valley, that is our existing mandated paratransit service area. And I bring up the point mandated specifically because that is not analogous with our current service area in which we provide dial-a-ride. This is just the 3/4 mile mandate from ADA around all of our existing bus routes. And we then compared that to the system that we could potentially have if all of these new services from the 304 projects got added in. And that's what you see in the darker purple. So it's quite a bit of an expansion, especially on the 2 kind of farther edges of the valley. And we did calculate to see how much of a change that would be. And it's about a 46% growth in the total paratransit service area that would be mandated for us to serve. And at this point, I will hand it back to Omar.
If I could please, before you take over, Omar, I want to point out one fact. The things that were presented to you were really meant to show the projects that were presented and the challenges that when we look at things and propose things, especially on the regional through a portal, how it is many ways contradictory, because you cannot build connectivity from the bottom up. You have to look at when you look at all these gaps, you can see that putting a park and ride, for example, with no existing service to it creates real problems, because you've got to now see what the existing service is. Putting commuter rail in one city without recognizing that commuter rail doesn't exist unless it goes all the way through creates other real issues. So that's why I hope that you saw that the projects, while many of them, if not all of them, are very worthwhile, it does create a larger discussion, because you can see how the portal suggestions have created a dilemma in creating not only gaps, but unintended potential for unintended costs, like this right here about the paratransit service. If we were to implement some of these things that were proposed, it creates a add-on to other obligations, and financial and otherwise, that aren't brought up through this process. So that's the purpose of going through that. So thank you, Marty and Omar, for pointing those out. So now I'll turn it over to Omar.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Marty. So beyond the maps that Marty provided, there are a few projects that we did not map that we think are still important to call out today in this presentation. So this list here shows the most of them, but do want to call out a few specific ones here at the bottom, because these are the projects that we typically don't think of. They're typically the projects that we don't map. They're typically the projects that are not considered sexy, but they are important. So those are the safety and security improvements, and of course, the state of good repair type projects with replacing fleet vehicles and refurbishing our facilities. Do want to note as an example that these projects, while important, are also expensive. So just one example of replacing the light rail vehicles, number 7 here, original light rail vehicles, or original 50, that could be up to $300 million. So do want to call out that these projects, while we did not map them earlier, they are important. So just moving on, before we turn over to Mag, just with some final observations and takeaways from that process Valley Metro staff have gone through. So I think Marty's map, as Scott mentioned, was very important in showing how the gaps in the regional system when we map these 304 projects that came through the portal. So really it's a question of how do we fill those gaps, and how do we use limited regional resources to fill those gaps. Speaking of the limited regional resources, we see, again, that just at the high level sketch costs, because we're still developing these costs, at the high level that to implement these projects, we're looking at $26 to $37 billion. Again, we will continue to refine those costs, and especially be able to break out the cost of filling in the gaps, as Marty pointed them out. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we still have to consider the existing system and operating and state of good repair of that existing system. So we're looking at about, again, the $104 million to operate the currently regional funded routes, and that does not include routes that are currently right now locally funded, and does not include rail operations and state of good repair. So really we see that these requests, kind of the needs exceed the regional resources. So really I think it's a question and discussion of how do we come to terms with this, and then how do we make decisions regionally to fund these projects. So I'll turn it over to Mag, both Audra and John, to speak to more of that discussion on the regional resources.
Certainly. Thank you, Scott, Omar, Marty, for that introduction and overview of the projects and programmatic ideas that were submitted as part of our RTP call for projects earlier this year. My name is Audra Kester-Thomas. I'm the Transportation Planning and Program Manager, leading up the effort for the development of our next regional transportation plan that will inform for Maricopa County the extension of Proposition 400. We're going to provide a bit of an overview in terms of a policy context, as well as a planning process context on where we go from here. I'm joined today by John Bolin, who will also provide some historical context for you today. And at the end of this, I think we'll be really interested to hear your observations and take any questions that you have as we continue this conversation with our policymakers over at MAG. Next slide. So again, just a bit of an overview about what we're going to present. We'll talk a little bit about the RTP development process. We're going to give you some information about what our peer regions are doing, really germane to today's conversation in particular. Give you a little history on transit funding here in this region, the role of local funding in particular. It's very unique for our region. And then next steps and questions with our policymakers. Next slide. So let's talk and first begin at the RTP development process. This next slide will show you our performance-based evaluation process. We are required by federal law and by state statute to develop an RTP that's performance-based. And different from Proposition 400 era, we actually have additional federal targets that we have to meet and respond to, tied to a really important funding source for us here in this region, which isn't just the half-cent sales tax, but a considerable amount of federal funding that comes by way of formula to this region, both through federal highway funds, in part that we have used historically for transit, but also Federal Transit Administration formula dollars that help enable our transit system today. You'll see we start with a large needs catalog evidenced by some of the transit submissions you've already seen today. We're at now about 1,400 different submission ideas. That includes deferred projects also out of Proposition 400. We're projecting about 40% less revenue over the term of the 20-year tax. That means real projects. That means real service that we won't be able to deliver from our transit program. It means real freeway projects and arterial projects that we won't be able to deliver by 2025. But it also includes system-wide needs that both MAG and our partners at Valley Metro and Arizona Department of Transportation certainly have been evaluating and studying over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. Next slide. So again, by way of reminder, while today's going to focus a lot on the transit conversation, the reality is we're faced with a considerable amount of needs, and they span multimodal. So freeway and highway needs for the region, as well as arterial improvements and a variety of other multimodal investments that continue to be identified, both in terms of a local perspective, but also a regional need. A fast-growing region such as ourselves continues to see a higher demand for transportation investment. But we're also coming to terms with the reality that some of our infrastructure is now aging and have certain questions regarding the maintenance and operation of those investments, as already referenced with transit asset management. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit more about what our peers are doing. I think this provides some really important context. Next slide. We did this summer a really robust peer region analysis. Many of these are our economic competitors. You'll see we focused on regions largely west of the Mississippi, similar to us, high growth areas, similar in composition in terms of an economic portfolio, as well as a transportation need portfolio. Those regions are identified with a blue dot. We did have a method to our madness. You'll also see we identified and were ensured to include regions that included Valley Metro's transit authority peers. And you'll see those regions highlighted with a green circle around them. So each of Valley Metro's transit authority peers were included in our regional analysis. Just a note, metropolitan planning organizations are usually much larger in footprint than the transit authority for which is included within. They're typically smaller in footprint, largely either tied to the urbanized area or an urban growth boundary in several of our regions. Next slide. So, one of the big takeaways that we hope you'll walk away from our presentation with today is that we are just struggling to keep up in terms of total revenues to forward transportation in this region. You'll see on the far left, MAG region as a per capita revenue for transportation, one of the lowest in our peer regions. Next slide. This becomes exacerbated, particularly when you look at transit. As by way of reminder, we have a current half-cent sales tax. Proposition 400 is the second initiative that we've implemented in this region. Our first, as referenced by Scott earlier in our presentation, was Proposition 300. It, at the time, was one of the first sales tax initiatives in the country and has really largely been modeled across the country. It's really important to remember that it was always envisioned that we'd have a second half-cent sales tax that would trail Proposition 300, which at that time was focused only on freeway investment. The second initiative was going to be another half-cent, and that would be dedicated to transit. Some of you may remember called ValTrans. That initiative ultimately failed, and it's one of the reasons why Proposition 400, the renewal in 2004, did include a multimodal level of investment. It did not change the bottom line, however. It was a continuation of a half-cent at another 20 years. So when you take a third, 33 1/3%, which is codified currently in state statute, that equates to 0.17%. When you look at our peers, it is not uncommon. In fact, it's usually customary to see at least a full cent dedicated to just transit investments of a sales tax. You'll see identified in green text those peer authorities for which Valley Metro identifies, and you'll see all of them with at least 1 full cent used for regional transit investment. Next slide. We have been monitoring what's happening with our other peers. It's important to remember that we are not the only ones looking to extend or expand our local transportation investments. We continue to monitor those initiatives that are occurring nationwide. Last night, there were about 10 initiatives on the ballot countrywide, and once again, voters have largely approved those initiatives, about 70% based on the numbers my staff provided me right before this meeting. Cap Metro is one of them. Not only do they have an existing 1 cent sales tax, they proposed last night an additional 5 property tax to further extend rail capital and operations program, about $7 billion, and that passed, and that was called fairly early in the evening. Other initiatives across the country that passed last night was sales tax in Seattle, another sales tax in San Antonio, a bond initiative in Fairfax, Virginia. So again, we continue to see transportation initiatives largely viewed favorably by the public across the country, even within a pandemic. Next slide. So I'm going to turn this point of the presentation over to John Bolin, who will give a little bit more context on a historical view of transit funding in this region. And so, John, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Audrey. Good morning, everybody. Next slide, Omar. So when we think about Proposition 400, really the basis for that was the 2003 RTP. The MAG Regional Council approved the 2003 RTP in November of 2003. And as part of the planning process, there's actually a determination to allocate a third of the sales tax to transit. That was later codified in state statute, and that's what we see today. As part of that planning process, policy decision was also made to allocate a portion of MAG FHWA funds to fund transit, as well as the FTA formula funds. And of course, as we all know, the transit component of the RTP is managed by Valley Metro and the Board of Directors. Next slide, please. So of the sales tax allocation to transit back in 2003, the chart on the screen displays the breakdown. So just under 45% of that went to the rail program, with the remaining portion going to bus. About 7% of overall transit funding went to ADA, with the balance going to regional bus, as well as the bus capital that supports that. So think park and rides, bus replacement, things of that nature. Next slide, please. And really the basis for the 2003 RTP was this planning concept. So prior to Proposition 400, there was a wide variance in routes and transit service across the valley. So there's different transit frequency. Routes operated with different headways. They operated with different hours. So really the intent was to identify key regional routes that were called supergrid routes, and provide regional funding to bring them up to a consistent level of service no matter where you're at in the valley. There's also a phasing component to that. So not all the routes necessarily came online right when Proposition 400 started, but it was intended that some routes would come on later throughout the Proposition 400 sales tax collections. Next slide, please. So as both Audra and Scott had mentioned, then came the Great Recession, and all of a sudden the region was facing a significant decrease in revenues, about 40%. So at the time, the Valley Metro Board made a policy decision to move away from the plan-based approach and move to the funding-based approach that we have today, what you all know as jurisdictional equity. Next slide, please. So just so the slide that you see on the screen today shows the allocation of equity throughout the regions. And so really the challenge is that the world today looks a lot different than it did back in 2003, and even different than it did back in 2009 when the policy decisions were made. And that provides some challenges and certainly provides some insight into how we want to devise our transit system moving forward. Next slide, please. So before we move on further, one of the points of clarifications I want to provide, the 2003 RTP did not allocate the half-cent sales tax on a jurisdiction by jurisdictional basis. However, what it did, one of the stated goals of the 2003 RTP was geographic balance. So it was important to policymakers at the time to provide a balance of investments across the 3 subregions, West Valley, East Valley, and Central. And so what you see is a difference in investment priorities back in 2003. So the West Valley prioritized freeway investments at the time, whereas the East Valley put a higher priority on transit and arterial investments. Next slide, please. So as we've noted over and over again, one of the really important elements of regional transit system is the local funding. We are a bit unique in this region. Next slide, please. And as we all know, there's a number of cities that have actually adopted their own transportation sales tax. So in many cases, a significant portion, if not all, of that sales tax funds transit within those jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So the chart on the screen shows the total amount of funding that has been allocated to transit across all modes, specifically focusing on fiscal year 2019. And what we found that of all the funding that went towards total transit operations, almost 70% of it came from local resources. So the vast majority of it. Next slide, please. So the slide on the screen probably tells that story in a more telling fashion. And so this shows all the local bus routes that were operating in 2019. And what we see is of the 60 routes that were operating in 2019, only 6 were entirely funded by the region. An additional 23 had a combination of regional and local funding. And the vast majority, or the majority, 31 out of the 60, were funded entirely by local resources. Next slide, please. We see a similar story when it comes to express buses, though the region does pay for more of those than they do for our supergrid routes. So of the 21 routes that were operating in 2019, 13 were funded entirely by the region. 2 were partially funded by the region, partially funded by local resources, and the remaining 6 were funded entirely by local resources. Next slide, please. So what does it all mean? Next slide. So one of the really unique attributes, or the challenges, if you will, that we're faced with today as we put together the extension of Proposition 400 is that we have ongoing operational commitments. This was not necessarily a feature of Prop 300 going into Prop 400, but really as we put together our plan, we have to keep that under consideration. So just looking at the total amount of regional resources that go to fund ongoing operations, so that includes both local bus operations, ADA, planning and support, about $104 million in 2025 is allocated to that. That represents almost 20% of the total half-cent sales tax collection. So this certainly will be a challenge and something that we're going to have to account for moving forward. Next slide, please. And again, the map on the screen shows a breakdown of the different funding compositions. Next slide, please. So what is the path forward? Really the question that we've placed in front of the MAG policymakers is, what do we envision for our regional transit system moving forward? Do we want to go back to the original Proposition 400 model, which is a long-range plan-based approach? Do we want to stick with our current approach, which is more of a funding allocation approach? Or a potential third option, which would be new to this region, but certainly not new nationally, would be to migrate to a formula-based approach. So with that, I'll turn it over to Audra to provide a little bit more insight.
Certainly. Thanks, Omar. Next slide. So this formula-based approach on a performance-based programmatic aspect is not new. And in fact, as referenced by John, is really standard practice across industry. What it really does is it ties level of operating assistance for bus service to actual performance based on, based on audited data that's calculated annually with adjustments made to the funding support accordingly, which positively correlate to actual service performance, whereby regional outcomes are really prioritized. Next slide. There are certainly advantages and challenges to each of these three alternatives. Going back to a long-range plan-based approach certainly would allow us to put lines on a map and endeavor to deliver that kind of service. But when it relates to bus service, you all know how easily and how much flexibility and response is necessary for bus service. Markets change, demand changes, population changes. And it's even sometimes difficult to put together that 5-year short-range program that you do at Valley Metro. And you all know you go through every 6 months a series of service changes to reflect the latest market demand changes. We could continue with the current fixed allocation model. It would certainly be a continuation of policy, but there are some challenges. It doesn't prioritize regional outcomes. And there certainly has a variety of other equity matters, especially when applied at a regional level. It also isn't flexible or responsive to demand and market changes over time. Or we can do like our peers and migrate to a performance-based approach. It really will better identify scarce resources from the region, place where the demand really is driven. And certainly allow us to align with a performance-based approach. It would take some time. We would anticipate several years of a transition, but it's important to remember that we might be able to layer in several of these alternatives as we move forward into a new bus operation strategy. Next slide. So we're going to come full circle now and end with the same questions we began with. These are what we have placed with our policymakers who have to weigh really tough choices at MAG. And as you've seen, with very scarce resources from a regional level and tremendous need and desire for transportation investment, we have a lot of trade-off conversations that are ahead. And I think we like to leave you with the following, what are the core elements of a regional transit system? And moreover, what is the region's responsibility in funding that regional system as opposed to local communities? We're here anxious to answer any additional questions. We certainly have challenges ahead, especially if we retain at a half cent. The reality is when you look at the full portfolio of transportation investments in this region and you look at what our peers are investing in transportation nationwide, we're going to have to set really important investments aside. We will not be able to deliver certainly this robust of a transit program, let alone the freeway, highway, arterial, other transportation investments that our member agencies have asked regional resource support for. And so I think this is a really good point, Scott, for us perhaps to, I'll turn it back over to you. Perhaps this is a good opportunity to open it up to chairman, members of both committees to ask questions.
Thank you, Audra. And as we've said in the beginning and during, the purpose of this with 300 plus proposals submitted through the portal was really to give you an overview of really the types of projects and everything that was supported, but also to identify and raise questions about how can we match the desire and the process, which has been, as I mentioned, a bottom-up approach with the two questions that are reviewed here. How do we really want to define what a regional transit system is? And secondly, how are we going to allocate regional resources toward that definition? And I think what you saw, or I hope you saw, was the complexity in that question. It's not an easy thing because expectations seem to be not aligned with first of all realities and the amount that we have, but also with a very blurry description of what this the answer of what this question would be. So we hope we've raised some relevant questions that can then be taken. We do have a couple slides on the next steps that would be taken. I think you have those or not. But the next steps, there we go. And basically, I guess I'll just finish these off. We are continuing to work with MAG. The process to develop the Regional Transportation Plan is a MAG process. And we don't want to have there be any lack of clarity on that. It will work through the managers committee, the subgroup, and then eventually on to the regional council and the TPC, which by statute is the determining body, the Transportation Policy Committee. But everyone felt that because Valley Metro is a very different entity than it was 20 years ago, in the sense that our transit system, our involvement, and the mere amount of dollars that are funneled through Prop 400 and others that are funneled through this makes this part of the process a very valuable step. We wanted to make sure this information was on the table so it could be taken to the other forums and discussed as policies are decided upon. So we will continue, our staff will continue to develop high-level cost estimates. You saw some preliminary estimates in the billions. That did not include all of the gap fillers that would have to be analyzed in order to implement many of the portal proposals and suggestions that came through. We are presenting this now to, we did present this to our PTA. As I mentioned before, we will go before the VMR boards. And then we're hoping that it will lead to a more focused discussion. There have been already a lot of discussions on Prop 4 extension, but we're hoping this aids you as the managers in a more focused discussion on really the expectations and the realities as it relates to transit's role, expected role, and real role in whatever the plan that comes out as part of a Prop 400 extension is. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chair, for any discussion or any questions or anything people may have.
Sure. Thank you, Scott. That was a very thorough, very robust presentation on the item. I know there are probably questions, observations that the rest of the group have. I just had a quick process question more than anything else. Do you anticipate revisiting this item for any further comment or direction from this group or the governing board? Do you have a preference for comments that may assist you or your staff in what you're asking us to do? Would you like those written? Would you like those deliberated? It's a process question.
Thanks, and thank you for asking. As we've mentioned, what Valley Metro, and this is by request from our board members primarily, because as you know, we have 19 members of our board. I think there are 6 mayors and the others are city council members. So our board members is a very different group than regional council, which is primarily mayors. Mm-hmm. And they have very strong feelings, as many of you know, on transit and its role. So our purpose in this was to work with MAG to present information and put it on the table. We will go as far as this group or MAG or others asked us to go. They have asked us to present some higher level cost numbers, which we're working on. But as for that, we feel that providing this forum and presenting this data for your consumption in your analysis, then we're going to live with what we have. We're going to wait and see what our boards instruct us to do in 2 weeks, and work with MAG in order to fulfill the needs to finish this project. I want to reiterate, at the end, this is a MAG process. Valley Metro plays an important role in analyzing and in providing information and in answering questions, but the decisions will be made through the MAG process. And we don't want to, we want to supplement that, to help that process out. We don't want to be a distraction. And we're hoping that through this information and the role that we can play, that we can help to advance the discussion of MAG. So what we specifically do will be determined by your requests and by the board's requests. And yes, it's much easier if those requests are at least given to us. They can be given now verbally and we'll jot them down. But if there's something specific, certainly a written request, I think is easier because we can get clarity. I don't know if that answered your question or confused the issue more, but
no, it did. I think it does. I thank you for that. And more importantly, at this point, I'd really like to open it up to the group and invite them to share any observations or questions, comments, that type of thing. So any feedback for Scott and the team?
I have a question. This is Chris.
Yeah, go right ahead, Chris.
Thank you. Audrey, John, I'm not sure who takes this question. As I recall, in previous presentations, you've indicated that you estimate the total amount of revenues collected on the half cent for a 20-year period, I think, and 2020 dollars is about a 500 million. Is that close?
Are you there, John? Do you want me to answer this, or do you want to?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the management committee. Yes, looking at our sketch estimates, we're estimating between 500 and 550 million.
Okay, that's fine. Here's where I'm trying to go with that. So if you take under current, I guess, authority or whatever state law, that's 33% of that would be limited for transit. Am I saying that correctly?
If we don't change state law.
As it exists today, 33% of that $500 million would be allocated for transit. So that's about 167 million, correct?
Yes, and that is embedded in statute. That is what the law says.
So if you have 167 million, and then you deduct from that the 104 million to continue operate the existing operations as they are, it appears to me you're talking about a possibility of a discussion of new transit of $63 million. The concern I have is I saw on one of the slides, while we've identified the 104 million, I think it was Omar or someone talked about, well, and here's all the things that are not in the 104. And I guess I'm curious because if it's 104 netting out from the 167, we're only talking about $63 million possibly available for the next 20 years. But what I guess I'm concerned about is what is not in the 104 that we would identify just to keep the existing transit commitments ongoing. What is not included in that number? Because it seemed like there might have been some pieces, I don't know, it was safety or there was a list of things that I'm concerned are not in the 104. Can someone identify those for me? And
yeah, if I could, Chris, I'll do that. The 104 is that amount committed to operations. Under the current scheme, by statute, 33% of the Prop 400 the Prop 400 collections are dedicated to transit. By policy, and this is not statute, but it's policy, 43% of the 33% is dedicated to capital needs, primarily light rail. So that's where your 60 some odd million dollars comes in. It goes into the non-operations portion of the 33%. So the things that aren't listed and would have been utilized for that 60 plus million dollars, if we use that number, would be those amounts dedicated to state of good repair, other capital projects that are project related, and that's what, when Omar put that out, those are the things that are not included in the as monetized, in addition to the $100+ million that go to transit operation, primarily bus and paratransit.
Okay, so help me out. That's what I'm trying to understand is there really isn't, if we continue if we assume the half cent is a continuance, if we can only get that approval, and we continue with the current operations as they're in place today, are we saying that there really isn't any additional dollars or additional transit? It's really just to maintain what we have if you include all these other items, or is it 63? That's what I'm trying to understand, because we're having all these discussions about 300 projects when in reality we still have the projects that are in place today, and the commitment to make the payments on those with a continuation of half cent. I guess my question is there really any money, any funding left even if we were just to approve the half-cent continuation?
Well, right now, the amount that non-operating, the capital has been totally committed to projects, just like on the street side. We have specific projects such as Light Rail South Central Extension and other things. There's a regional transportation portion of that in addition to the other sources. All that money through Prop 400 has been committed. There are projects that have dropped off because there wasn't sufficient funds to build the capital projects. So if you're going to expand operations, that has to come from somewhere. And unless you change the 33% from the half cent, which is statutorily in there, or you extend or expand the half cent to a larger amount, you do have 60 some odd million dollars that is currently, and under the current program, it goes to capital projects. And your choice then is a reallocation. You either submit that to expanding operations, or you use them on finishing out the Prop 400 projects that were not completed, such as some of those light rail extensions and other types of capital things, or state of good repair, or you forego state of good repair and try to do that from another source. The challenge we have in state of good repair in transit is that it's different than it is in roadways. We can look at our freeways and see potholes and things like that, but you can still drive on those freeways. It's a miserable experience and you don't like it, but it doesn't render the roadway completely unusable. In transit, if we don't replace those cars that Omar has talked about, or we don't keep our some of our basic safety issues, the system shuts down. You can't put a bus or a train out there unsafe. It simply doesn't run. And so it really is an all or nothing as far as state of good repair, because you can't do it. And the good example is what we saw in Washington, D.C. WMATA, which is their version of Valley Metro, deferred state of good repair to the point that once their system hit 30, 40 years old, it started breaking down and the entire system was shut down, created a mass disruption, and they still haven't recovered from it. Our system, our rail system, for example, is now 12 years old, and during the portion of Prop 400 extension, it will hit that critical 25 to 40 year lifestyle. And so there are real demands on state of good repair that are not monetized and were not included. They were included in some of the proposals, but that's where you'd have to get it from, Chris.
No, okay, so that's my concern, I guess, from the position of a community that already has a commitment to transit, that the need for the extension of the half cent is critical. But I guess I don't want to overstate this, but it sounds to me that just a continuation of the half cent, there is no additional dollars for adding additional routes.
That's
if we're
correct.
going
That's
to maintain
correct.
the system in a state of good repair. And I guess, I don't know if we're just afraid to say that out loud, or do we need to say that? Because at some point, we can't go going around making these presentations and creating expectations that we're trying to make an evaluation of something, some new lines or additional mileage, when reality is the half cent, if we can get it approved to continue, will only sustain what we have today. And that's, I guess I'm just worried. I don't want to create expectations that we can't deliver on. So I don't know if it's fair for me to say that out loud, or if you don't want me to say that out loud, or what's the point? Because it seems to me that should be a statement of our calculus here when we're presenting to policymakers. So I don't know if I'm way off. Help me.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Brady, if you may, I would love to jump in on this question. It's an important point. Two things I'd like to clarify and provide maybe some level of certainty to. The codification of what we call firewalls, that modal allocation that is codified in state statute, came at the conclusion of the RTP development. And so MAG developed the we are federally authorized to do and required to do, and developed the modal assignments based on good planning practices that was later and ultimately codified in state statute after the plan was ultimately developed. I think MAG's position on whether 33 1/3% is the right modal allocation moving forward. Our position is we don't know what the right math is for a modal assignment. and even consideration of future flexibility moving forward. But we know that's not the right math. But we're going to let the planning process help us to determine what that looks like. But then second of all, Mr. Brady, I think you bring up a really important point. It's something we've said at MAG. You know, at the very root of it, if all assumptions continue as is or status quo, very simply, the only way our transit network in this region expands in quality of span of service or in reach is if it is locally funded. And I think that is an important point that can't be overstated enough, that unless we change the composition or amount of additional funding, the slides that Omar and Marty walked you through are just unattainable.
Sure, and that's a good point, but let's make a point. Currently, and for all those who want to enter into this world of transit today, the standard has set that there is already at least a 70% or 50 to 70% match by those who are participating today. Is that not correct?
It's inconsistent, Mr. Brady, Mr. Chairman, members of the board committees, jurisdiction by jurisdiction in terms of the percentage or proportionality of local funding. Taken as a whole, 70% of transit operations is carried at the local level. Some communities have a larger proportionality of jurisdictional equity that are contributing to their regional transit investments. Some have none or are only submitting local funding to enable those transit investments. There is not a consistent match policy.
And I will add one thing, just to, since in the hopes that there is some reality, we at Valley Metro consistently get requests from cities, either your policymakers, board members, or whatever, for funding at the regional level for additional services. And that's generally expansion of services, filling in what we call our transit deserts, especially on the northwest, southwest, and southeast portions of the valley, or the potential for funding local circulators. That is a common request. So I think there really is a disconnect in this, and we basically tell them there's no money available. Everything we have has been programmed through the end of Prop 400 in 2025 for operations as it currently exists. And that doesn't even, as I mentioned, begin to meet the demands or the expectations from the original Prop 400. So I think there is a little bit of a lack of recognition of the reality out there, which is, you're exactly right. The only way that we can expand our transit services, either, as Audra said, through an expansion of reach or frequency of service, is through a reallocation within the plan or an expansion of the base. We simply don't have it to add any services right now, and it will not exist through whatever the plan comes up. Doesn't exist.
And Chris, I would just maybe correct the use of match, because match implies that everybody's bringing the same dollars to it.
Fair enough.
So the reality is it's more of a 70%. It's 70% locally funded. But if you look at that chart on page 20, that number is a little bit misleading, because Phoenix is at 80% local funded, and we just overwhelm the numbers. So 70% isn't even particularly.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I think Mr. Zerker's point there was simply to further illustrate that the proportionality of local funding contributions relative to regional funding to enable bus operation support is inconsistent city to city. Phoenix, Tempe, Mesa being heavy lifts in that, but inconsistent and no policy match currently.
And I think, once again, it goes back to the original question. What is regional transit, and how do we allocate regional resources to that? That's why we pointed out this as a basic question, because if you're going to decide how to allocate regional resources, you really need to figure out how you define a regional transit eligible project or process or service, whatever you want to say.
I think I might have muted myself. I'm sorry about that. So I don't know what I said that the people heard. But I said Phoenix is at 80% and we're so much that it even makes the 70% an overstatement and that it's not a match. But maybe another way to look at it is we put in 0.6% of sales tax in Phoenix into transit. So if you look at what Phoenix is investing to get that level of service where you can have rapids and circulators and frequent local bus throughout, 0.6% is what we're putting in. So, you know, people who want to get to that level, I think, have to think about what sort of local investment it requires to even get to where the regional investment can put you over the top, as we're currently structured as a region.
And as Ed said, even though 0.6% is a very vibrant investment, when you combine that with the regional funds that funnel through Prop 400, it still leaves us below what nearly every one of our peer cities are investing. So even with that vibrant of an investment, we don't match up with what others like Salt Lake and San Diego and Denver and Dallas are investing in their transit systems, most of which are a full percentage point or more combined just to transit, not to the whole thing. So yeah, we're falling really far short in this region as far as our overall investment in transit, no matter where you are. And we've seen the benefits in Phoenix, when that additional investment came up. So those are the points that we're making.
And I think maybe to Chris's point about expectations is a really good one. One of the conversations I think we have to have is just what's a reasonable expectation of a 0.5-cent regional tax for a regional transit system. And I think the reality we're seeing is that the expectations and the appetite is way beyond what is realistic with the current tax. And the sooner we have that dialogue, the sooner we're going to get the policymakers to talk about, then either we need to talk about expanding the 0.5-cent tax, or we need to shift our focus to something else. But I think Chris has got the right point, which is the longer we kind of go on with this big, huge menu and our eyes are getting huge, it's just going to make it harder at the end when we ever have that conversation. So I would say we need to have that conversation sooner rather than later. And that's what I've heard from Chris, and I would agree with that.
Thank you.
Chair, can I make a comment?
Go right ahead.
Not to agree 100% with Chris and Ed, but I also believe that 104 number, I believe that's in current dollars. And so, just a note that those operations, operations only increase, salaries, benefits, those are things that only increase over time. So I don't know if we've done that calculation, but if that 104, grows over the term of the tax, there's even less available over time.
And Julie, if I could answer that,
that's
a great
excellent
question. I think what we've tried to do is put everything into 2020 dollars. So many of our projections on revenue and that, we've tried as best we could to match those two so that it accounts for the revenue inflow will match what we think the expenditure are. So you can at least, while not perfect, it gets us close to a dollar for dollar, an apples to apples comparison.
Any other conversational points, observations for Scott and his team? A lot of good conversation.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank everyone for their comments and their direction. And I know we're on a hard stop because you got MAG management and MAG staff asleep, but just thank you for your input and your comments. And we'll be looking forward to additional direction on how to proceed. So thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Unless there are any other comments, we'll move on through the rest of the agenda here. I believe we have the approval of the minutes from October 7th. I need a second to approve those. Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve.
Second, Julian Goodyear.
Any opposed? All right, fantastic. We'll move on to the consent agenda. We have a couple items. Any questions of Scott or his team by the members on any of those items? If not, I'll entertain a motion and a second to the consent agenda.
Kevin Glendale, move approval.
Do I have
Kempton, second.
I have a first and a second. All opposed? Any opposed to approval of the consent agenda? All right. Hearing none, we'll move on to item number 7, regular agenda item. And this is for insurance coverage renewal. And I'd like to ask Mr. Smith if he'd like to add anything to prep us for this item and the vote.
If there are questions, I know we're running late. We do have a slight presentation. Insurance is something that has been a topic of hot discussion among your staff and everything. So if you have questions, I have both Mike Manow and Mike, are you going to take this, or is Jim Hilliard or Paul? Like, I can't remember which one was going to take the lead on that.
This is Mike Manow. Thank you, Scott. If the board is Mr. Chair, and if the committee members are interested, I'm happy to share a couple key points.
Does anyone desire any more detail than what you received in the staff reports from Mike?
Mr. Chair, I'm comfortable with what we're doing. I understand the world of insurance here, and so I would move approval.
Excellent. Do I have a second?
Second.
Great. I have a first and a second. Any opposed? Fantastic. Hearing none, we'll
Who
go on
provided
to,
the second, please?
I think that was Chris Brady, right? Chris, was that?
Correct.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to item number 8, quarterly reports.
And Mr. Chair, these are presented for information. If there's, so we'll move on unless there's questions specifically related to any of the reports in the quarterly report.
Any questions? All right, hearing none, we'll go on to item number 9, travel, expenditures, and solicitations. Again, it's an informational item. Any questions, observations on any of the items reported this month? All right, excellent. I'd like to ask the group if they have any quick updates and or requests for future agenda items that Scott and his team can prepare for. Any suggestions, comments? All right, I think that kind of concludes everything. I think Scott, Pat, the next meeting is January 6th, correct? So we get the month of December off. So seeing that, I'd wish everyone happy holidays and a safe return in January of next year. And I think with that, Scott, I'll turn it back over to Pat so you can start the rail management meeting.
Absolutely. So, Chris, you can start whenever you'd like. If you want to wait for people to get off, or just move right ahead. Your call.
Wait for the ping ponging to go.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Oh. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We want to welcome everybody to the Rail Management Committee meeting of November 4th, 2020. Pat, the first item I have on is any comments about public comment we need to cover?
No, I will be calling Blue Crowley later this afternoon for his comments and then insert them in the minutes. That'll be approved in January.
Thank you. The next item is the minutes. This is minutes from the October 7th RMC meeting are presented for approval. So request a motion for approval.
I'll move approval. This is Ed.
Ed, motions for approval. I need a second.
I'll second that, Stephen from Tempe.
Thank you, Stephen. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Very good. Next item is the consent agenda. Are there any items? Let's see, we have the Planning and Community Relations Support Services contract extension and additional funding. And we have a non-revenue vehicles purchase. Those are the two items, I believe, that are on consent. Any questions? If not, I'll ask for a motion for approval.
I'll move to approve, Stephen.
I'll
Stephen,
second Ed.
Ed motions, Stephen motion for approval. Ed made the second. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Very good. Item number 4 is future agenda items, request and report on current events. Any comments from the members on any future agenda items? Very good. Next meeting will be Wednesday, January 6th, 2021. With great optimism, we get to 2021. If there's no other items, I believe we conclude, we're ready to conclude this meeting. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank
Thanks
you.
to all.
Ready?